Well, Tracy, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to talk to you about this game. We've been playing it non-stop since you sent the copy of it. So thank you very much, and it's lovely to see you.
Oh, it's good to be with you. Thank you. I'm glad to hear you're enjoying it.
So first up, I'd love to get into the game in a little bit, but I'm keen to know a bit about your background in making games. How did it all come about, you thinking, right, I'm going to stop what I'm doing and I'm going to start making my first game?
Well, certainly the pandemic kind of gave a lot of free time to explore this, but the decision to make it certainly happened well before our current conditions. It really came out of my university studies. I had decided to go back to university as an older student to study design, but I had long had a passion for history and had enough credits to pursue a history degree at the same time. And so I did that. And at the sort of apex of my studies, realized that there was an opportunity to bring the two disciplines together. This was a very odd thought to people at the university, save for the history department, who were actually quite intrigued with the idea of doing history in what is considered in academia as new media. For gamers, it's like media. It's stuff we love and play. It's just part of our life, part of our world. And so, I started thinking about, well, if you do, most historical games that are really good are very heavy. I mean, I'm talking about GMT games, which I personally really enjoy because of their accuracy and for their gritty detail. But they're a 5 on a scale from 1 to 5 in terms of heaviness, and that's just too difficult for people to get into. So when I started thinking about how I wanted to approach it, I wanted to take the opposite, or sort of go in the opposite direction. Make games that people could experience history, but they didn't necessarily need to know or even care to know the detail. The detail would inform the design and could be accessible to anybody that would want it there. But it wasn't going to be necessary to play the game. And so that's where design came in, because design has certain ways of making you think about simplifying and distilling and putting the focus on sort of attributes, characteristics, mechanics in the world of games that you want someone to experience. And so if you use design to sort of get to the historical point you want to make, which in the case of Katana is about medieval Japanese warrior culture, games are actually a pretty successful vehicle for doing that. But it does take a lot of work. It's not a matter of compiling, like I sort of said earlier, compiling a list of facts, putting them on cards, slapping some illustrations, and then calling that a historical game. It's just a bunch of facts in a box. And I really wanted to, not just with Katana, but in all the games that I make, bring history into games so that it can be experienced rather than as a replacement for reading a book.
Sure. So when was this? What are we talking period-wise?
So, geez, this was 2019 was when I started. I actually started making Katana as a class project.
Right.
And I had previously worked in the video game industry and had kind of burnt out. Was like, you know what, I'm going to go study design, sort of figure out what I want to do moving forward. And was initially resistant to the idea, of making board and card games, understanding that there are so many of them. Like, how am I going to stand out?
Yeah.
And it was making this connection in early 2019 that I can do something different here. It requires a different process. I can't, making a historical game, I don't just make anything, right? Like, I can't make up history in the sort of games that I produce, but that also gives me a focus. It tells me what sort of things are sort of in my wheelhouse that I should move forward and create. So when I started thinking about, okay, I want to make Katana into a commercial release, let me bring it to Kickstarter, that was when I started thinking, okay, what's going to happen after Katana? Like, and it really helped me to solidify the theory behind my games, that they weren't just one-offs. I just want to make a samurai game, so here it is. And it was, I'm coming at this from a sort of ideological perspective, to use a big word, that I believe in the games that I make are a way of representing history for people who otherwise aren't going to really engage in the material, because they don't like reading, or they don't want to sit with a 600-page, academic monograph. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes they're really boring. So I kind of take it on my, as like a task or a mission to be like, I'll read all of that stuff.
Sure.
I'll sit through all the boring stuff and then pick all the really good parts and package it up so that way people can explore these really amazing cultures. I mean, Japan is just the beginning. I mean, there's a lot of really cool things that I want to do, and I'm excited that it's been resonating with people just like you.
So when you thought, okay, I'm going to link history with card games and bring those two passions together, I mean, history is pretty broad, right? You've got a lot of history to look at. What was it that drew you towards the samurai culture in your first card game?
I was actually inspired by a video game I had seen. Well, there's a bunch of video games that do sword play. And it made me think, this is not something that you really see in tabletop games, because it's so twitchy. It's action oriented. It's so fast, and in order to get that authentic feel of holding a sword and being in combat, a video game is just superior because you get immediate feedback. It's a little crisper in terms of the visual presentation, because it's right there. It's immersive if it's in first person. And that doesn't quite translate as well. And so I was like, no, I think this can be done, but it has to be approached in a different way. And so the game did not start out initially from I want to talk about medieval Japanese culture. It started out as, how can you take this very unlikely mechanic of sword fighting and turn it into a turn-based game? And I immediately went to Japanese combat, because as a young kid I had experience and had been introduced to the swords, the katana, and had actually done some training with bamboo wooden sticks that they have. And so having that knowledge as a child, where they were not clanging their swords and trying to just mindlessly attack, but were really conscious about, sort of sizing up their opponent, very methodically thinking before acting. And I thought, what a marvelous connection to make, because this would be a way of getting at that action feel of a sword fight, but still being authentic to what that particular culture's interpretation of combat is like. So to say, you have your cards in your hand and you take a few minutes to think because you're sort of, got analysis paralysis, that's okay.
Yeah.
Because in that medieval Japanese combat, some of those warriors would circle around, waiting for that perfect moment before then they would step forward and slice the other person in half.
Sure.
And so it made sense to me. And as I started digging deeper into the theme, I realized, oh no, now I can actually add layers of culture into this that will then make it more than just this interesting mechanical exercise and turn it into really a historical experience.
That makes a lot of sense. But playing the game, that rings true as well. You do feel like you're in a sword fight, and you don't feel like it's playing slow because it's turn-based. It just feels like you're in this battle between two very thoughtful warriors who are thinking about their moves really in a deep way, rather than just slashing about in some kind of brawl, And so that rings true when you play it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are definitely enough games where you get the sort of sword clang. I need to acquire a huge offensive bonus to essentially smash you to pieces.
Yeah.
I enjoy those too. Historically, that tends not to be how battles are won. Most battles are won through cleverness and through strategy, through tactical superiority.
Mm.
Numbers. Ask anybody who studied the Roman Empire. They lost lots of battles. They only ended up winning historically because they never quit. They would just throw more soldiers into the mix. So
Yeah.
more numbers, better weapons doesn't always win the battle. It tends to be the intelligence of the commanding mind.
Sure. So at the start of the game, you get to choose your, is it Kami? Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Kami, which is some kind of spirit god protecting the fighter. Is that correct?
Yeah. So they're sort of indigenous or deities to the Japanese islands. Um, Different though than the Olympic gods,
Mm.
who were very much human or humanized figures.
Hmm.
While Kami had personalities like a human, they were usually like forces of nature, the
Mm.
wind, the sun, or unusual rocks,
Right.
large trees, unusual features. And it was later in Japanese history that you started to see the kami include deceased emperors, famous warriors. And so you get this sort of expansion of the idea of what a god can be.
Mm.
And it's very different from what we conceive of it in the West, where there's sort of a separate plane of existence and we sort of supplicate and hope that we receive an answer. There's much more of a interaction.
Sure.
And the symbol of the shrine, the Torii gate that is used in the game, and I'm sure you've seen in photos throughout Japan, represents a metaphysical gate.
It's here.
Exactly. That
Yeah.
is in Shinto is seen as a gate between our world and the sort of spiritual where the kami reside. And the kami, unlike us, are able to sort of more easily go between the two worlds.
Is that sort of why it's kind of going up over a hill and into the beyond? Is that the idea there?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
So when you're picking from your Kami, the symbols on the cards here have intrigued me. Is that just an aesthetic choice, or do these symbols relate back to something in Japanese culture?
Both. So, one of the questions I had to ask myself in designing this and other games is how much license am I going to afford, certainly visually, but also mechanically in terms of gameplay, to sort of deviate or modify historical elements. And I think that the Kami logos, if you will, are a good example of how I've done this. There's a specific word in Japanese for these. They're called mon, M-O-N, and that's precisely what they are. They're logos, and they've been in use for centuries.
Wow.
And what's really interesting is that they were initially used to designate religious sites. And so over time, families that were patrons of these shrines would use these symbols on their own insignia. And of course, these families had warriors. So the warriors would then use the insignia on various pieces of armor, on sashes that would go on their back so they could be easily identified as belonging to a particular army.
Mm.
And so in the medieval period, there were compendiums, anthologies of these insignia that were created. And so not all of them survive, and not all of them are in color. But there's one dated called the Omaji Rushi that is dated, I believe, the 17th century, so 1600s, that chronicles all of these insignia, these mon, and all of the sort of heraldry that was used by samurai clans of that age.
Wow.
And so what I did is I went and I looked at some of those and, said, okay, I know, for example, Tenjin, who was, his name means heavenly deity, was this former statesman who was exiled and died in infamy. And so he became this kami, and he was known to have this symbol that was called the plum blossom logo. And so I looked at the historical examples, and it's literally just 5 circles in a star-shaped pattern.
This one?
And that exactly is right, yeah. The original historical logo is just the circles. It's very plain. And if you don't realize, from the historical Japanese perspective, it would have been immediately identifiable. But I was looking at it for the first few times as a Westerner and going, polka dots? Like, I don't understand what's going on here. And I realized, did a little bit more digging. I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to embellish on this. And so you've got the center of the blossom. The whole thing's a blossom.
Yeah.
And at the center of it, you've got these sort of swords and shields, the tip of a sword and these little shields. So there's a martial element to it that I've added. And you'll see that in other bits of the cards. The circle around everything is also sort of just a visual motif that was used in other Mon that I brought in here to help give it that kind of stamped feel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's actually an aesthetic choice. I mean, I think that's what makes games really powerful because, quite frankly, history is not something to be dug up in a book or in the ground and sort of put on a pedestal and then we, quote unquote, read it. And that's the truth. It's some objective thing. That's not how it works. History is you and me talking right here. It's us. It's me designing this game. And if I were to use, for example, all of the historical materials exactly as I found them, quite frankly, it wouldn't be appealing because it would just look like this sort of collage of very old visual ideas. And I'm talking about things that we take for granted, like aligning things or proportions and scale. The Japanese were pretty advanced in terms of their visual design thinking, but they didn't have computer-aided design in the 14th century, right? So things are not precise, and being able to go in here with a computer and creating historically researched but ultimately revised designs, I think is acceptable. If I went in there and, for example, did a wisteria blossom instead of a plum blossom for Tenjin, then it would be like, well, then there's no history there. There's no connection. There's no justification for the modification because you're essentially ignoring what was the nugget of truth there, which is as long as there's some association with that plum blossom, I think inspiration that builds on that is perfectly acceptable.
Sure. I'd love to meet the guy who originally designed these all those hundreds of years ago and have him be transported to now and be like, your stuff's in a really cool game now. Like, can you imagine now? He'd be like, oh, that's a lot better. I like the circle around it. That's really cool. I like what you've done there.
I mean, I was researching some of the visual stuff. It's like, wow, this was made 1,000 years ago, and it's better than logos I've seen now. These people were just incredible. These artists were ahead of their time.
Yeah.
And that's it. There were some bad ones. I mean, like the triangle. The diamond shape, rhombus, was used very often as a sort of a stand-in for an imperial emblem, because the emperor had the chrysanthemum and no one could use the chrysanthemum except for the emperor, but the rhombus was given by the emperor to his most favored people. So the rhombus you could, but if you had like multiple rhombuses, that was acceptable and the emperor couldn't control it. So you saw this proliferation of logos with like 5, 7, 9 rhombus shapes, and they look so silly now because it looks like a pattern and it looks so desperate too, right? It's like, but we have that now, right? Like it doesn't, to pick a country, there's always this sort of brown noser who's like, oh, I want to be in good with society, so I'm going to do, put on the trappings of being better than I really am. But it's like, we see the 30 rhombuses in your logo. That's not from the Emperor, dude.
So on these Kami cards, you get these at the start for the setup, and it essentially gives you your active and passive powers in the game. There's also the variation of your kamikaze, which is a big one-off power that you can do. The question I have about them though is the setup. So on the cards as well, we have this setup here, which is how you're setting up your armor. What's the history there?
So yeah, there's so 2 points I want to make. The first is that I really thought carefully about having a supernatural element, these deities in the game, because I think, and the reason why I decided to do it is because it is part of the experience that Japanese individuals had at that time. Regardless of whether or not today we believe that kami exist or not, for a medieval Japanese individual, whether they believed the kami exist or not, kami had an influence in culture. They were part of the history, and to not have them included in the game or in any discussion of medieval Japan would be an oversight and would not actually be telling the full story. So when I think about, and moving to the sort of second point I want to make, which is sort of where the historical basis is for the way that the kami cards are designed, starting with the health and the armor. The association with a kami historically was usually based on lineage. So if I came from the Hosokawa family, I'm going to worship a particular kami because that's the tutelary deity of my clan, right? Now that wouldn't, that doesn't mean this was not a society in which worship or devotion was exclusive. It just meant that was primary, or you had a filial family responsibility to look after your tutelary kami. So that kami in that sense sort of shapes your life, regardless of whether you want, you don't have a choice, right? You're born into a family. This is your family's kami. So, and I thought, well, I don't want to lock people into a kami, right? Like every game, I want them to explore new kami, new concepts. So I thought each kami should have a different health configuration, and they all have equal health, but the configurations themselves inform potential strategies. So armor, naturally, can only go on a body part. So you have 4 health, and armor can be stacked on top of those health. And one of the things that's, the kami essentially, in addition to determining your health configuration, have these powers, as you mentioned, this passive ability that's sort of always on, and then this active ability that you have to activate using a purify card. And these are loosely based off of the characteristics of the kami. Design-wise, they are, certain kami are easier to make a mechanic for than other. Ryujin, which is on the card, is noted as being a marine kami, and Protean, which is changing, is sort of a shapeshifter. That I interpreted as defensive. Like a shapeshifter is a really good power to have because you can get out of situations, right? I'm also thinking of like Mystique from X-Men, where like she just can disguise herself as something else, and that's very powerful because it enables them to get out of those situations. And so I thought, well, I can't let someone the power like be nullifying themselves out of battle, because the whole game is to combat. So I thought that's a defensive advantage. Let me interpret that as you have armor bonuses. Fudu Myo, which is Buddhist inspired kami, is sort of this rage-filled warrior, and was particularly known as really popular among samurai. He's really powerful and has a really unblockable attack, which sort of represents very directly the strength and that sort of fury of the warrior that he was known for.
Sure. That's cool. So pronounce that again, sorry.
Fudo Myo.
Udomyono. That you have the +4 unreflectable attack for that one, but you can only hold 4 cards as the passive, which I'll come on to that in a second. And then the Ryojin here, you have the +1 armor token and +1 armor against initial attacks. I like it. It's a really nice intro to the game. You get dealt 2 and you choose 1. And the first few times we're like, well, I don't know what the difference is. And then once you've played the game a few times, you're like, for so long, you got 2 cards. I don't know, and I love it. And you can get more later in the game, but generally that's the one you're with for the game. So yeah, coming back to may only hold 4 cards, and this brings me on to the shrine cards here as well. This was something I was messaging you when I played my first game the other night. I was unsure if I was reading the rules correctly, because some of these things are bad for you as the playing player. So as a choice, you can go to the shrine and choose one of these, and most of them are pretty good, gain an attack bonus or draw an action card or immunity from attack. And then you then get bad ones like lose all attack bonuses and discard an action card. And my assumption was, well, you play that on your opponent. Whereas my wife, who I was playing with, was like, no, you've gone to the shrine, you've chosen the shrine, this is on you. And we were sort of debating it. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to ask the guy that designed this. He'll tell us what it's right. And you said, yeah, it's on you, because sometimes things don't quite work out. It's like life. And I was like, that totally makes sense. And I like that, but you don't get that so often in games. But I guess you don't get so many games that are based on history, right?
Yeah. I mean, I have 2 points in that. One is related to the history, and the other is related to game design, and they're really sort of separate. On the historical point is exactly what you said. These are individual entities. They're not lapdogs. In fact, they might think the other way around, that you are the lapdog and they're upset that you're asking them to, for their power. I'll grant it, but lose armor or lose a bonus. This is in many ways, this is sort of a universal religious cultural principle, wherein we see this in Greek religion, the idea that, I'm going to provide a little votive offering, pray to one of the gods, give me a safe journey, give me a safe passage, may my wife, give birth and be healthy. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. And then it gets sort of, whatever happens gets explained accordingly. So if it's a votive that's offered to Asclepius, the god of healing in ancient Greece, then, so the person dies, they say, well, Asclepius didn't like the votive, or somebody else, one of the higher gods decided to override. There's an explanation process that occurs, and I thought that's really interesting. And it's the same thing that happened in Japanese, where, a warrior would say, I'm going to fight on behalf of this entity, this kami, and then they win or lose. And if they win, it's because of the kami, and if they lose, people say that kami is now dead. Nobody follow him, so it's this kind of interesting narrative. The second thing was about game design. I think you really hit it on the head. You don't see this very often in games, where there's sort of negative consequences. It's often, and I think there's a good reason for it. Is that a lot of people don't like them because they want to have a game, they want to be enjoyable, and being penalized in some way breaks that enjoyment. You probably tell by my expression, I don't really ascribe to that thought, because I think for me, a game is simply that. It's a game. Let us play. Part of playing is, I think about it as a playground. Sometimes you scrape your knee, but you get up and you continue playing because you've been running around. Just because they scrape my knee a little bit doesn't mean it ruins the game. It's part of the risk of being in the game, in the perspective that you aren't going to win, or you aren't going to always get your way. And so I think that's fine. And I think even if this was not historically based, I think having some, negative feedbacks in a game can be helpful. It can also incite moments of drama. Now, I think there's a limit. Chutes and Ladders is an excellent case study of really bad implementation of negative feedback, whereas you can lose the game right at the end by being sent all the way back down a chute, and that's just bad. It's just not a very good game in general, right? It's just a simple children's game. But I think that is a highlight. I think that's why people don't like negative feedback mechanisms in tabletop games, because they remember that experience as a kid of the game of being penalized to the point where they don't win. And that can happen in Katana. I mean, I've certainly had a game where, the last couple turns, it's very exciting because you think you're going to win, and just things kind of crumble, and you draw a bad shrine card, and that handicaps you in just a way that is fatal. And that's a bummer, but I also am sort of like, well, I'm glad that's not real. Like, this is the whole point of the game. Like, that would happen. Sometimes these battles between samurai would go back and forth and would be hours. And sometimes it'd be like, okay, no, we're just going to give up. Thank you. We are both skilled. Like, we'll go our separate ways. And sometimes they would be over in a heartbeat because someone just got the luck of the draw, or they were just that much better. I mean, I had when I was playtesting, one of the playtesters became so good, wasn't worth me playing against him anymore, because he knew how to win very quickly. I mean, he had played so many times, and I thought, that's cool. There should be a balance between luck, chance, and skill. Any game that is completely skill based is going to only be attractive to super hardcore gamers.
Yeah.
And any game that is completely luck is going to be completely unattractive to hardcore gamers. So somewhere in the middle is a balance that's going to be compelling, not as a way of trying to reach everybody. I don't think that's possible, but as a way of getting to something that's sort of good. Because I want people to be able to come in and their skill can carry them to the victory, but they've got to also deal with randomness, because that's good games have all great games have an element of chance, an element of luck somewhere in them. And the ones that don't, they don't achieve that status, in my opinion.
Sure. Unless all the cards are the same or the dice only have one number on it, there's always chance in games.
Exactly.
And in this game, I think you negate it brilliantly with lots of mechanics. But one mechanic I want to bring up just finally now is, like you talked about, your health is laid out in the structure that your kami tells you. You place your armor over that. When you're first hit, the armor is removed and it's then straight to the body, I guess. Then when you hit that particular part of the body again, blood is drawn, I think is the phrase that you use. And when that happens, you as the attacker have to take pollution over a part of your kami, right? So you have to time when you're doing things. You can't do that if you need to use that part of your kami power immediately afterwards. You can't just blaze cards down if you're blessed with really great cards and your opponent doesn't have anything to counter it, because there's ways that the game is going to negate that anyway, no matter what the cards are drawn. And I think that's really, really smart. The first time we realized that was happening in the first game, both of us, when we were playing, just kind of sat there and looked and just thought how clever that was, because it changes the interaction so completely. And I haven't really noticed that before. You're punished for having a clean strike. Like, when are you punished for having a clean strike? Well, Katana's when you're punished for having a clean strike. And I love it. It's so good. So I just wanted to mention that, because it was just a really wonderful moment in our first game, and we really enjoyed it every time since. I'm conscious of time, but I've got a couple more questions I want to ask. So this is your first game, right?
Yeah.
And it's brilliant. I hope people are going to pick it up, and it will be a massive success. So what's next for you? What are you going to do? You've got the whole of history to pick from, right?
Yeah. So Katana was the game that I had made as my design thesis project, but it was not actually what I focused my historical studies on. My historical studies in university were actually ancient Greece and Rome. So that's where my next game is going to be. It's called Fragments of Rome. It's a tile placement game. It'll be for 1 to 4 players. And it's based off of this giant 3-story marble map that was created in the beginning of the 3rd century, that only exists in piecemeal fragments. We have about 15% of this map, and it is literally a marble puzzle.
Wow.
That historians, a very small group of historians, are trying to piece together. And I was very fortunate when I was doing a research paper. I was put into contact with someone at Purdue University who's working on scanning all of the marble fragments and doing sort of a new effort at interpreting these fragments. And it stunned me that this map is completely unknown. I mean, people don't realize that this map, it's called the Great Marble Map of Rome. It was built by Septimius Severus in the year about 203. And it was enormous. There was nothing like it in the ancient world. And quite frankly, there's not been a lot like it ever since, because this thing was, the size of a building.
Wow.
And it showed the entirety of the city of Rome. So to have the knowledge that was on this map would just be incredible, because it would tell us things about the ancient city of Rome that we just don't know.
Yeah.
We know about the main temples. We know about the emperor's palaces, but we don't know about the buildings that people lived in, and the vast warehouses that stored all the grain that was brought from Africa. So my game is going to be essentially set in the modern world, and you are one of 8 different personalities. You might be a professor, you might be a grad student, you might be a politician in Italy, that are all part of this effort to reconstruct the map in a new museum based in Rome. But you all have different agendas. And the game is really about exposing that history is this process of dialogue. And that, we can dig up these marble pieces and we can scan them. In the game, you do that. You sort of dig up the pieces, you scan them, and you put them on the board. But it's all interpretable, because you don't know which pieces go with which. There's only so many pieces, and there's way more space on the board to put them on. So it becomes this sort of tug of war about, I'm a Roman politician and I want to show, Roman force, like we are a new emerging force. And so it's going to show all of these government buildings under the emperor bill in a strong state. Whereas the professor is like, that's BS. Like, we need to show that there was all these residential complexes. And so you score points accordingly. And so it gives you a little bit of insight into ancient Rome, but also into history, because I think people have this perception that if you sit down, you read some books, that's history. You dig up some artifacts in the past, that's history. And it's unfortunately not that easy. It's a lot more difficult. So that's Fragments of Rome. Right. And the other thing that I'm talking about is the next edition of Katana. So Katana, was my first game. It's a small game for 2 players. And as soon as it went to print, I was filled with ideas of making it much bigger. There's so much more history that can be done. So there is going to be a new single player campaign that I'll be introducing, and that I'm very excited about, because I'm taking that as an opportunity to go much deeper in the history. So the campaign will have a narrative. It will introduce 2 new action cards. So you'll have new abilities to use in battle. There'll be additional kami. There are some notable absences. There are gaps in the kami that are provided. Those will, in terms of some of the more important deities that were venerated in the medieval period, those will be making an appearance. And then the big addition is 2 additional players in the player count. So up to 4 players. There's going to be an initiative mechanic that gets brought into the game. So there's a matter of timing when you attack or are attacked that will sort of come into play. That will ensure that you can't. One of the things I'm really careful about in designing this is I don't want there to be sort of coordination. I don't want there to be 3 players deciding, okay, you go, I go, then you go. so we can kill this person. It's going to be a little bit more complex. It's sort of 4 people on their own, and it's going to require a lot of strategizing. I mean, I think as you played the game, sometimes it's a matter of just surviving yourself is winning the game than it is sort of trying to defeat your opponent, because the margin for error can be very slim. So on a 4-player level, that's where most of the work is right now, is trying to work out the mechanics. You add players to a game and it gets harder to play test. It gets trickier to figure out what's a problem versus a style of play. So single player campaign is moving along. The 2-player editions, the new cards and stuff, are essentially designed, but I'm sort of stuck right now with 3 and 4-player play testing, given the current conditions, and just generally it takes more time. But yeah, both those games are coming out next year.
Exciting. So are they going to be standalone games or expansions to this?
So Fragments of Rome will be its own game. Katana 2nd edition, what my plan is right now is that it will build off of this game. So essentially kind of like it will be its own standalone game in that newcomers can just get Katana 2nd edition and that's fine. But I would like it that those who have this game can essentially merge all of the cards with the 2nd edition. So that way there's no money lost there. Especially one of the things that I'm keen to have is a larger box, because there'll definitely be more components.
So it's that will kind of provide this one.
Yes, exactly. So it'll provide an opportunity to sort of upgrade for those who have this current version.
Sure. Oh, that sounds amazing. The campaign one as well. I'm really excited about that. I'm a big fan of solo campaigns with things like this, and I can't imagine how that would work with this, but I can't wait to find out. Where can people go to find out about Katana and buy this game?
Yeah, so right now it's available on the game's website, www.katanacardgame.com. I'm working on getting it on Amazon as well, so that way, particularly for those outside of the U.S., we'll have an affordable option for shipping and acquiring the game. And that's it for right now. This is my first game, so I'm still working on establishing distribution contacts and the like. So definitely keep your eyes peeled.
Sure. Well, I would encourage everyone to go check it out. It's a brilliant 2-player game. You're locked in this tight strategic battle that ends ultimately in somebody dying, but it's a really calm game. Like the best way I could describe it is it's like Mortal Kombat on the computer merged with like meditation and Azul. Like that it's hard to describe it because the vibe you get when you're doing it isn't representative of what you're actually doing. But all I can say is we love it. It's brilliant, and I would urge everyone to check it out. Tracy, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I can't wait to see what happens next with your next game and the development of Katana. It was wonderful speaking with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful for your time. Thanks, Jen.